Everybody. In the next couple of videos, I'm going to focus on three topics related to Catholicism in the 16th century. First is the Council of Trent. Then I'm going to talk about Ignatius of Loyola and the formation of the Jesuits. And I'll finish up talking about Teresa of Avila, who is actually probably my favorite historical figure, in her reform of the Carmelite order. Okay, so let's talk about Trent. In the 19th century, the German historian, who's had a lot of impact on history, period, named Leopold von Ranke, coined the term Counter-Reformation to describe the Catholic Church's activities between the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 to the Peace of Westphalia in 1638, all right, which ended the 30 Years' War. This term kind of became the norm for many years. However, this term really minimizes the activity of the Catholic Church during this time, okay? It makes it sound like all of Catholicism's actions were merely reactionary, and that is simply just not the case, all right? The 16th century was a time of great renewal for the Catholic Church as well, though it faced unprecedented challenges, all right? So I'm going to use the term Catholic Reformation or simply 16th century Catholicism in this lecture. Arguably at the end of the 16th century, yes, the Catholic Church had kind of taken a beating. Yes, people had left the church, but in some ways it was actually stronger than at the start of the 16th century. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Trent here. For years, and you might have noticed this in some of your other readings, Emperor Charles V was pushing for a council to deal with the Luther affair, okay? He really did view his role as emperor as the protector of Christendom, okay? And he took this really seriously. You know, he was a very pious person, all right? So why was a council so slow to happen? There's some various reasons. Kind of at the beginning of the whole Luther affair, the Catholic Church didn't necessarily see Luther and everything that happened as a huge challenge. All right, yes, there were people who did, Johann Eck, I'm looking at you. But as I noticed earlier, the 95 Thesis was not supposed to cause like these huge theological debates that it actually did. In fact, early on, Pope Leo X remarked that the whole ordeal was nothing but a squabble among monks, okay? And then there's some other issues. We've got political situations, all right? Because Germany wanted a council, France didn't, all right? Germany and France were always at war with each other. And the Pope needed kind of these monarchs in these big Catholic countries to get on board with the council. And for a long time, they just weren't, mainly because France was allying itself with Protestants, and the whole situation was really messy. So there's that. Then there's actually kind of a lack of consistent leadership in the Catholic Church. There were actually 7 different popes between 1513 and 1565, all right? Now compare that to some of the secular rulers such as Charles V, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, all right? They had really long reigns and provided very consistent leadership within their countries, all right? So we do eventually get a council. The first phase is 1 year before Luther dies, actually. Okay, so the first phase of Trent, Pope Paul III, and we'll meet him again, he authorizes the Jesuits, first he actually tries for a council somewhere else. That falls apart politically, and then he calls a council at Trent in 1545, and he oversaw this first phase. Trent was formally opened in December of that year. It had really, really poor attendance, especially at the start. Only 31 bishops showed up when it began. I think there was over 100 once it closed, but it was a pretty small showing considering how many bishops there were in Europe. Okay, some decisions were made. Things regarding scripture and tradition, sin and justification, and the sacraments, but major issues like the Eucharist was left alone. Throughout this council, the Pope and Charles V were really at odds with each other. They were fighting about the authority of the emperor. And so it wasn't super productive, all right? So when the plague appears in Trent, the Pope decides to just call the council, all right, for health reasons, and people leave. All right, so then we have about 6 years later, the second phase of Trent, all right, a new pope, Julius III, who had been pretty active in reforming activity before he was elected pope. He actually called Trent back into session. Charles V, having just won the Schmalkaldic Wars, was even strong-armed some Protestants from his empire to attend, though really the Protestants were kind of a non-issue at this point. They weren't taken into consideration, and reconciliation was not being considered anymore. Okay. Once again, the Pope and the Emperor, so Charles and Julius, were clashing. They were fighting over what the council would even accomplish. Decisions were made on the Eucharist, penance, and confession, all right? But France was now allying itself with the Protestants against Charles, okay? So again, we've got some real political issues underpinning this council. And then Julius dies unexpectedly, and so the council is postponed once again. Okay, and then kind of in between the second and third phase of Trent, some big things happen. Okay, after 34 years as emperor, Charles, exhausted, resigns. Okay, he steps down. He ends up living his last 2 years of life at a monastery. The Holy Roman Empire goes to his brother Ferdinand, and his son Philip was ruling over Spain and Italy. The next Pope Paul IV actually denounced the emperor's agreement to the Peace of Augsburg. His solution, he was a real kind of hardliner. His solution to the Protestant issue was to increase the Inquisition and kind of hunt out any inklings of heresy, in his words. Okay. And this became very militant. Like, a number of Catholic books were banned. Actually, Erasmus's works were banned during this. So there's just a real hard crackdown. But he dies after only 5 years. All right. And Pope Pius IV replaces him, and he's more of a reforming pope again. Okay. And he calls the third phase of Trent. All right. And that phase is from 1562 to 1563. All right. So it's almost, not quite, we're almost up to 20 years between the first and the last phase of Trent. Okay. And what's really interesting now is that, of course, you have this big delay between phase 2 and phase 3. All right. In phase 1, we're hoping for reconciliation somewhat with Protestants. By phase 2, it's looking pretty unlikely, but Protestants actually come to the council. All right. By phase 3, we're in an entirely different situation. Reconciliation was definitely not in the cards, and the Jesuits have become a powerful force by this third phase. All right. So what did Trent accomplish? Some really key issues. Trent affirmed much of Catholic doctrine. Now, I need you to remember that before the Protestant challenge, the Catholic Church didn't necessarily have to have everything defined, all right? Because, yes, you would have certain, challenges, but nothing like the Catholic Church. So the church actually had to write out. And so Trent really comes to define Catholicism between the 16th century, and then, of course, Vatican II was another big shift in Catholicism. And we'll talk about that later, kind of towards the end of the semester. All right. Another one of the big issues is scripture and tradition. Okay. Catholics in general were pretty confused by the idea of sola scriptura. All right. Remember that the church was actually kind of established before the canon was, if you remember from History 1, right? Bishops were involved in what books were actually put into the Bible as we have them today. All right. So the church kind of says, yes, there needs to be harmony between scripture and tradition, okay? But the church's has authority in interpreting scripture, okay? So kind of holding both tradition and scripture is kind of equal importance. All right. There's the issue of the Vulgate. If you remember, Jerome translated this in the 4th century, and it was revolutionary for the time, but it had been well over 1,000 years. Okay. And so the council agreed, like, yes, the Vulgate is authoritative, but they also agreed to work on a new translation. All right. And then finally, let's talk about original sin. According to Luther, the human self is completely corrupt. The image of God is kind of broken. It's gone. Catholics reaffirmed the original opinion that Adam's sin had affected human nature, but baptism removed the stain of sin. All right. And so that after baptism, all that remains is potential sin. And this, of course, encourages spiritual living. Okay, I am going to wrap this video up, and then we will talk about Ignatius and Teresa in the next video. Thanks, everybody.